to this point. None of this is normal. Deploying top administration officials to do media interviews or use their official government social media accounts to call Abrego Garcia a criminal and a terrorist is not normal. And yet that's exactly what people like the Attorney General Pam Bondi and Presidential Advisor Stephen Miller have been doing. For the record, Garcia has not been charged, let alone convicted of any crimes. The claim that he's a terrorist stems from the allegation that he's a member of MS-13, a gang that the Trump administration recently labeled a foreign terrorist organization, but that's also in dispute. In her initial order, Judge Zenas noticed, quote, defendants, meaning the government, have offered no evidence linking Abrego Garcia to MS-13 or to any terrorist activity, end quote. And this is why this ultimately matters so much. Due process. The Trump administration is more interested or perhaps more comfortable making these claims in the court of public opinion rather than the court of law, where its claims would receive close scrutiny. But if the government has evidence that Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a criminal and that he poses a danger to society, and if they're as confident about the strength of the case as they seem to be in public, just prove it in court, because that's where these things are supposed to happen. Joining me now, Jennifer Rubin, co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Contrarian and an MSNBC political analyst, and Barbara McQuaid, former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. She's also an MSNBC legal analyst, co-host of the Sisters-in-Law podcast, and author of the remarkable book, Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us. Jennifer, I have to go back a few days where the president of El Salvador was in the White House, and then Stephen Miller came in and started talking about Abrego Garcia, and J.D. Vance is talking about him. They're all making what one might think are compelling cases about this guy and whether he's a criminal or not. They're just not making them in court. They're not making them in the one place they can. If the government gave this guy protection from deportation and then determines that he's either dangerous or a criminal or whatever the case may be, why not just use the system that's in place?
Well, that's the same question that Senator Chris Von Hollen asked when he returned from visiting Abrego Garcia. He said, put up or shut up, which was the perfect response. But I want to be clear about something. Even if he is a criminal, even if he is a member of a gang, that's why we have due process. Criminals get due process. Donald Trump got due process in New York, charged with 34 felonies for which he was eventually convicted. In this country, we have due process for everyone. And so they are playing this very devious game in which they are slipping and sliding and fencing with the court. And, you know, in the April 7 opinion, when they said you cannot be sending these people off without due process, the dissenters warned, and they said, if you go forward with this stuff, you will be in defiance of this court. And what they were saying is you should have gotten to the merits. You should have been more clear, because you can't trust this administration as far as you can throw them. And guess what? That's exactly where we are. And if not for the heroics of the ACLU last night, they could very well have slipped more people out of the country without due process.
Yeah, ACLU yesterday asked both the Supreme Court and I think the Fifth Circuit, Barbara, to intervene. And they did. A little after midnight. They wanted it before midnight. I think it happened about 1:30 in the morning. Both of those courts said, hold your horses on this. But Jennifer makes a really interesting point here, and that is that there's some slipping and sliding going on with the courts. There's some ignoring of the courts. I didn't know that that's what a constitutional crisis can look like. I thought it was defiance of the court. There's a big question about what do you do if you actually defy the court. This administration is dancing. But either way, it's bad.
Yeah, if they're dancing, Allie, they're dancing with two left feet. The most outrageous argument I think they made in the past week was arguing that when the court ordered that the government facilitate his release from custody in an El Salvador prison, all that meant was if he should somehow find his way to the border of the United States should let him in. There is no way that that's what the court meant when it said facilitate his release from custody in El Salvador. And we saw the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the ruling of Judge Zenas earlier this week, calling this out as just outrageous. One of the things we heard from Judge Harvey Wilkinson who is a Reagan appointee, very respected conservative member of the court, said the government's conduct here should shock not just judges, but every American. This is a complete denial of the constitutional right to due process. And so you're right, so far they seem to be, using every excuse other than my dog ate it. But at some point, they're going to get called on the carpet, and the question will be whether they say they get to do it anyway under Article 2.
Jen, one of the interesting things that happened in the White House, it was very surprising to see how different leaders are treated, right? Every time I see Bukele in the White House, I think about Zelensky and the way they treated him. But Bukele said, this guy's a terrorist. I'm not letting him out. End of story. How would I even get this guy back into the United States? Which is all Donald Trump needed, right? Bukele became Donald Trump's useful idiot at that point. That's just not a reflection of what this deal is. The United States pays El Salvador to house these people. I would suspect that if the United States said, we gave you the wrong guy, we need him back, that could be facilitated.
Absolutely. And in fact, the vice president of El Salvador let it slip that they are keeping him because they are being paid. So the court, for one, could enjoin this money. Two, they could order them, as the two judges already are, to get some explanation of all the steps they have taken. Have they made a request? What has been the response? What conversations have they had? What documents have gone back and forth? And as Judge Zena said, they've done nothing. And, people keep waiting for a constitutional crisis as if there's going to be a big national alarm bell go off. Right. We are in it because we have an administration that is in contempt and contemptuous of the rule of law. The only question is whether the Supreme Court, at least 5 of them, are finally going to put their foot down and do their job. The Supreme Court has given him much too much running room, starting with that disastrous opinion allowing him to have broad stretches of criminal immunity. And ever since then, they've been tiptoeing around as if they're afraid to actually confront the president. That is their job. Their job is to make sure the other 2 branches are abiding by the law. And if they can't do that, they might as well close up shop and go home. So if this accomplishes anything, if the magnificent lawyering of the ACLU does anything, and it finally stirred the Chief Justice to act, we will have reached a new turning point, potentially an inflection point. But the question really is not whether we're in a crisis, but whether the Supreme Court is going to do anything about it.
Barbara, I want to ask you about the approach the government is taking in this, and that is that they're trying very hard to paint the picture that Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a bad guy. And that you should not be sympathetic to him. It's the same argument they've used with the students who are being deported. No crime. We're not going to spend any energy proving a crime or demonstrating to the courts that there's a crime. We're not going to worry about due process. In fact, J.D. Vance basically said as much. The Democrats would have us go through a $2 million trial or something like that. Maybe trials shouldn't cost $2 million, but we're not doing away with them. We actually have a country founded on the idea of due process.
Yeah, if you listen closely, Ellie, as you have said, all of their focus has been on how bad these guys are. Every time they come out, it's they found a gang membership or they found some criminal activity, even though it hasn't been charged. We hear that again and again. But of course, in the United States, in our system of government, anyone who is present in the territorial jurisdiction of the country is entitled to all of the protections of the Constitution, and that includes